Imagine waking up one morning and the sun looks wrong. Not gone exactly, but dimmed. Like someone turned down the brightness on reality itself. The light filtering through your window is pale, cold, bluish. You step outside and the sky is there, but it's veiled. The sun hangs overhead like a faint disk behind frosted glass. Shadows are weak and strange. The air feels different, colder than it should be. And this isn't just a day. This is every day. For months, then a year, then 18 months of twilight at noon. This actually happened. In 536 AD, the sun vanished for a year and a half. Not completely, but enough that historians and scientists now call it the worst year to be alive in all of human history. Not during the Black Death, not during the World Wars. 536 AD. A year most people have never heard of became the hinge point for catastrophe that would reshape civilizations across the entire globe. What caused it? For over 1,500 years nobody knew. Ancient chroniclers described it in terrified whispers, a mystery written into tree rings and ice cores, and the apocalyptic writings of monks who watch their world die in slow motion. Only in the last few decades have scientists begun to piece together what actually happened, and the answer is more dramatic than anyone imagined. This is the story of the day the sky went dark, of a volcanic catastrophe so massive it dimmed the sun across 3 continents, of crops that wouldn't grow and populations that starved, of plague that followed famine like a shadow, of empires that collapsed and cultures that vanished into the murky haze of that terrible decade, and of the long, desperate climb back from the brink of civilizational collapse. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and let me know where you are and what time it is. I check comments, and it's wild seeing Sydney at sunrise, Stockholm at bedtime, all listening to the same strange stories from our past. Before we go deeper, if you're fascinated by mysteries from deep history, the kind of secrets buried in ice and stone and genetics, I've written a book exploring prehistoric catastrophes and forgotten chapters of human survival. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. Just a thought if that sounds like your kind of thing. Now, back to 536. The year the world stopped making sense. To understand how bad things got, we need to see what the world looked like before the darkness fell. Because in early 536, nobody saw it coming. Life was normal. Empires were rising. Trade routes hummed with activity. Harvests looked promising. And then, sometime around March, the sky changed, and nothing would ever be the same. Picture the world in early 536 AD, not the world that was about to die, but the one that existed in those last bright months before everything changed. A world that looked, to the people living in it, like it was heading somewhere. Maybe not perfect, but stable, functional. A world where empires had plans and farmers planted seeds expecting to harvest them, and merchants loaded caravans confident they'd reach their destinations. Start in Constantinople, the jewel of the Mediterranean, capital of the Byzantine Empire and probably the largest, wealthiest city on earth. 500,000 people packed inside walls that had never been breached, aqueducts bringing fresh water from miles away, the hippodrome hosting chariot races that could draw 100,000 screaming fans, markets overflowing with silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, wine from Greece. This wasn't some backwater clinging to faded Roman glory. This was a superpower at the height of its confidence. The emperor was Justinian I, and he had ambitions that would have made Augustus jealous. He'd already reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. His generals were preparing campaigns to retake Italy and restore the Western Roman Empire. He was commissioning the Hagia Sophia, an architectural marvel so ambitious it would define Byzantine engineering for 1,000 years. He was codifying Roman law into a comprehensive legal system that would influence European jurisprudence forever. Everything about Justinian's reign said expansion, consolidation, permanence. He was building an empire meant to last centuries. But Byzantium wasn't alone in the world. To the east, across the frontier that had defined great power politics for generations, sat the Sassanid Persian Empire. Just as wealthy, just as sophisticated, just as confident. The Sassanids controlled everything from Mesopotamia to the borders of India. They taxed the Silk Road trade routes. They maintained irrigation systems that fed millions. They had their own imperial ambitions and their own certainty that history was moving in their direction. These two empires, Byzantine and Persian, weren't exactly at war in 536, but they weren't at peace either. They were locked in the kind of expensive, grinding rivalry that defines superpowers. Proxy conflicts, border skirmishes, diplomatic manoeuvring, both sides maintaining massive armies and complex alliance networks. Both convinced that their system, their culture, their version of civilization was destined to dominate. Neither had any idea that something completely outside their control was about to make all their careful plans irrelevant. Further west, Europe was a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms built on the ruins of the Western Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy. The Visigoths held Spain. The Franks were consolidating power in Gaul. These weren't barbarians anymore, not really. They'd adopted Roman administration, Roman titles, Roman Christianity. They minted coins and collected taxes and maintained what trade networks they could. Life was harder here than in Constantinople, more localized, more fragile, but it was functional. People were making it work. In East Asia, China was fragmented into the northern and southern dynasties, a period of division that had lasted more than a century. But fragmented didn't mean collapsed. The Northern Wei dynasty controlled the Yellow River Valley. The Liang dynasty ruled the south from their capital at Jiankang. These were sophisticated states with bureaucracies, standing armies, extensive agricultural systems. They were competing with each other, sure, but they were also trading, sharing Buddhist scholarship, maintaining cultural connections that link the Korean peninsula to the Tibetan plateau. And connecting all of it, like threads holding together a vast tapestry, were the trade routes. The Silk Road wasn't one road. It was a network of paths crossing deserts and mountains, linking China to Persia to Byzantium. Caravans could take years to complete a journey, passing through dozens of kingdoms and city-states, but they kept moving. Luxury goods flowing west, gold and silver flowing east. Information travelling with the merchants, technologies spreading slowly but steadily across continents. But underneath all this apparent stability was a vulnerability that nobody recognized. Every civilization from Constantinople to Chang'an was fundamentally agrarian. Empires were just elaborate systems for collecting and redistributing food surplus. Everything, the armies, the bureaucracies, the great building projects, the trade networks, all of it depended on farmers producing more food than they consumed. And farming depended on weather patterns that had been remarkably stable for generations. Predictable monsoons in Asia, reliable Mediterranean growing seasons, spring rains followed by summer heat, followed by autumn harvests, year after year after year. The common people living through 536 had no concept of climate as a global system. They understood local weather. They had folk wisdom about planting times and harvest signs. They prayed to their various gods for good conditions and accepted bad years as divine displeasure. But the idea that something could disrupt growing seasons across the entire planet simultaneously, that the sun itself could dim, that was beyond anyone's framework for understanding reality. So when spring arrived in 536, farmers from Britain to Korea planted their crops like they always had, expecting summer, expecting warmth, expecting the sun to do what it had always done. They had no way of knowing that somewhere, possibly in the tropics, possibly in Iceland, possibly multiple places at once, volcanic forces were about to inject so much material into the upper atmosphere that the world would go dark, that temperatures would plummet, that their crops would wither in fields that never saw proper sunlight, that everything was about to break. The first people to notice were probably sailors. The sun rising over the Mediterranean that spring looked wrong, not dimmed by clouds which sailors knew well, not obscured by fog which burns off. This was something else, a veil between earth and sky that didn't move, didn't clear, just persisted day after day with an unnaturalness that made experienced navigators uneasy. Then everyone else started seeing it too. Procopius of Caesarea, the great Byzantine historian, was in Constantinople when it began. He was a careful observer, a man who prided himself on factual reporting, not given to exaggeration or mysticism, which makes what he wrote all the more chilling. During this year a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear nor such as it is accustomed to shed. Read that again. Without brightness, like the moon, not such as it is accustomed to shed. This is a man searching for language to describe something he's never seen before, something that violated his basic understanding of how the world works. The sun gives light. That's what the sun does. Except now it didn't. It glowed weakly through what he described as a dry fog, visible but providing little warmth, creating no proper shadows, day after day, week after week. From Italy, another voice joins the chorus. Cassiodorus, serving as chief administrator to the Ostrogothic king, was a practical man dealing with practical problems, managing food supplies, collecting taxes, keeping infrastructure running. His letters from this period weren't written for posterity. They were working documents, instructions to local officials, which makes them even more valuable as evidence. He's not trying to craft dramatic narratives. He's trying to manage a crisis he doesn't understand. "We marvel," he wrote to provincial governors, "to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, to feel the mighty vigour of the sun's heat wasted into feebleness." He describes the sun appearing bluish, the seasons feeling confused, not quite winter but never properly becoming summer. He orders officials to inspect the harvests, already sensing that something catastrophic is developing. His tone shifts through the surviving letters from confusion to growing alarm to barely concealed desperation. Then there's Michael the Syrian, writing centuries later but compiling earlier sources. He records that the dimming lasted 12 to 18 months, a year and a half, imagine that. Not a few weeks of bad weather, not a particularly cloudy season. 18 months during which the sun appeared as if through a permanent filter, during which the basic relationship between earth and sky seemed fundamentally broken. And this wasn't local. This wasn't the Mediterranean having a bad year while China proceeded normally. The Chinese dynastic records, meticulous as always, document their own catastrophe. The Beisha chronicles record unusual summer frosts, snow falling in August, trees failing to leaf out properly in spring, crops withering in fields that never received adequate heat. The bureaucrats recording these events had access to centuries of weather records. They knew this wasn't normal variation. This was unprecedented. What makes all these accounts remarkable is their consistency. Procopius in Constantinople, Cassiodorus in Italy, Chinese officials thousands of miles away, all describing the same phenomenon, a dimming of sunlight, a failure of seasons to behave normally, an agricultural catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. They couldn't communicate with each other, had no way of knowing their experiences were global. Each thought they were recording a local disaster, maybe divine punishment specific to their region. None realized they were documenting a planetary event, but the psychological impact might have been worse than the physical effects. This wasn't like a drought, which people understood, not like a plague, which had precedent, not even like a war, which at least had human logic behind it. This was the fundamental machinery of reality malfunctioning. The sun was supposed to give light and heat. That was cosmic order. When it failed, what did that mean? In a world without scientific frameworks for understanding atmospheric physics, people reached for the explanations available to them. Divine wrath, the end of days, apocalyptic prophecy coming true. The Christian world saw it as God's judgment. Persian Zoroastrians interpreted it through their cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Chinese officials framed it as the emperor losing the mandate of heaven. Everyone had their own framework, but the terror was universal. The sky itself had turned against humanity. And this wasn't just people being superstitious or primitive. They were responding rationally to something that truly was beyond normal experience. A modern person, even understanding atmospheric science, would find an 18-month dimming of the sun profoundly unsettling. For 6th century people, it must have felt like reality itself was ending. Every morning the sun rose wrong. Every day crops grew poorly or not at all. Every evening the temperatures dropped far below what the season should bring. The accounts that survive are mostly from literate elites, historians, administrators, court officials, people who had the education and resources to record what they were seeing. But think about the millions of others, farmers watching their carefully planted fields fail, parents trying to feed children when food stores were running low, village elders who had never seen anything like this, who had no wisdom to offer because all their accumulated knowledge about weather and seasons had become useless. The terror must have been overwhelming, not panic, not chaos, but a deep grinding fear that persisted month after month as the sun continued to shine weakly and the harvest continued to fail, and nobody, anywhere, could explain why. What nobody realized, what couldn't have been known with the science available at the time, was that volcanic material from a massive eruption had been injected into the stratosphere. Tiny particles of ash and sulfur dioxide so high up that regular weather couldn't wash them out, spreading across the entire planet on high-altitude winds, creating a veil that would persist until gravity and chemical processes gradually cleared it. The fog wasn't descending. It was already up there, miles overhead, turning the sky into a filter that scattered and absorbed sunlight before it could reach the surface. And it wasn't going away any time soon. Understanding what happened requires understanding what people in 536 couldn't possibly know. That high above them, so far up that air becomes thin and weather ceases to exist, something had transformed the atmosphere itself. The stratosphere, that layer starting around 6 miles up and extending to 30, had become poisoned with sulfur dioxide. Millions of tons of it, ejected by a volcanic eruption so massive it had punched through the lower atmosphere entirely. When sulfur dioxide reaches the stratosphere, it doesn't just sit there. It reacts with water vapor and oxygen, forming tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, each droplet microscopic, invisible individually, but collectively creating an aerosol layer that wraps around the entire planet. These particles are incredibly efficient at reflecting sunlight. They act like billions of tiny mirrors, bouncing solar radiation back into space before it can warm the Earth's surface. This is volcanic winter. Not cold because winter has arrived, but cold because the fundamental heat source has been throttled down. The temperature drop wasn't catastrophic by itself. Europe experienced cooling of about 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius during the summer months. That doesn't sound like much. A couple degrees. You might not even notice day to day. But agriculture operates on razor-thin margins. Crops aren't just sensitive to average temperature, they're sensitive to growing degree days, the accumulated heat over an entire season. Drop the summer temperature by 2 degrees, and suddenly wheat that should ripen in 90 days takes 110. Except you don't have 110 days. You have 90 before the autumn rains come and rot everything in the fields. One failed harvest is survivable. Communities in the 6th century maintained grain reserves. Careful families could stretch stores. Trade networks could move food from successful regions to struggling ones. But 536 wasn't followed by recovery. 537 remained cold. Then 540 brought another massive eruption, possibly even larger than the first. The aerosol veil, just beginning to clear, got refreshed. The temperature stayed suppressed. Harvest after harvest fell short or failed entirely. Grain reserves weren't just depleted, they were exhausted, then consumed, then gone. The cascading effects are what killed people. First year, you eat through your reserves. Second year, you eat the seed grain you were supposed to plant. Third year, you have nothing to plant even if the weather improves, and you're already weakened by malnutrition. Fourth year, you're dying. We know the temperatures dropped because the trees remembered. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, gives us a year-by-year climate record going back thousands of years. Trees add 1 growth ring per year, and the width of that ring depends on growing conditions. Warm, wet years produce wide rings. Cold, dry years produce narrow ones. It's not interpretation or theory. It's direct physical evidence, each ring a record of exactly how much that tree grew in that specific year. The growth rings from 536 are the narrowest in 2,000 years of European data. Not just narrow, the narrowest. Across Scandinavia, Central Europe, the British Isles, trees that had lived through centuries of variable weather encountered conditions they'd never experienced. In North America, where volcanic winter reached just as severely, bristlecone pines and Douglas firs recorded the same story. 536 shows up as a frost ring, damage from unusual cold creating visible scarring in the wood. Then 537 shows narrow growth. Then 540 brings another frost ring. The trees aren't telling a story of one bad year. They're recording sustained crisis, but the most precise evidence comes from ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, layers of snow accumulate year after year, compressing into ice that preserves an atmospheric record. Each layer traps tiny bubbles of ancient air and captures whatever was falling from the sky that year. Dust, pollen, and crucially, volcanic sulfate. When scientists drill ice cores, they're extracting a timeline. Each meter of ice represents decades or centuries of accumulated snowfall. Each layer can be dated with extraordinary precision using multiple methods. Counting annual layers visible in the ice, measuring radioactive isotopes, matching patterns with known volcanic eruptions. The ice core work is painstaking. Teams drill in conditions so extreme that metal becomes brittle and exposed skin freezes in minutes. They extract cores up to 2 miles long, then transport them in specialized freezers back to laboratories where the real work begins. Scientists cut the cores into sections, sometimes just a few centimeters representing a single year. They melt tiny samples in ultra-clean rooms where contamination is measured in parts per trillion. They analyze the meltwater for chemical signatures, for isotope ratios, for trace elements that reveal what the atmosphere was doing when that snow fell. The Greenland ice cores show massive sulfate deposits dated to precisely 536, then another spike around 540. These aren't ambiguous signals. The sulfate concentrations are orders of magnitude above background levels. Antarctic cores, drilled half a world away, show the same spikes at the same dates. This is the signature of volcanic winter, evidence written in ice, preserved for 14 centuries, waiting for technology capable of reading it. What makes volcanic winter so devastating is its global reach. A normal winter is local, regional at most. The northern hemisphere gets cold while the southern hemisphere experiences summer. Weather patterns shift, but balance is maintained. Volcanic winter doesn't care about hemispheres or seasons. The aerosol veil surrounds the entire planet, suppressing temperatures everywhere simultaneously. There's nowhere to escape, no unaffected region to trade with, no refuge where crops still grow normally. The people living through 536 couldn't have known any of this. They couldn't see the stratospheric veil. They had no concept of atmospheric chemistry or radiative forcing. They just knew the sun had weakened and the cold had arrived and the harvests were failing. What they were experiencing had a name, volcanic winter, but that name wouldn't be coined for another 14 centuries. The cause, massive eruptions injecting sulfur into the stratosphere, wouldn't be proven until ice cores and tree rings revealed the truth. But the effects, those they understood perfectly, those they lived through, generation after generation watching the sky remain wrong, and the temperatures stay suppressed and the food supplies dwindle. They didn't need to understand the mechanism. They were living the consequence, and the consequence was about to get much worse. For a long time, all of this was a story without a culprit. Historians knew something extraordinary had happened in the mid-6th century. The chronicles agreed on that much. Darkened skies, failed harvests, strange cold. But for more than 100 years of scholarship, the question of why remained maddeningly open. Somewhere on Earth, a volcano had exploded with almost unimaginable force. It had changed the course of history, and we had no idea which one it was. This is unusual. Many big eruptions leave obvious scars. Tambora, in 1815, carved out a crater visible from space and left written records across the globe. Krakatoa, in 1883, produced shockwaves that circled the planet and sunsets that entered art and poetry. Those eruptions have names, dates, witnesses. The eruption of 536 was different. It left no clean confession, no single smoking crater everyone could agree on. Just scattered clues, like ash on the wind. For decades, one suspect dominated the conversation, a volcanic giant in Central America called Ilopango. Today, Ilopango is a caldera lake in El Salvador, a tranquil sheet of water fringed by hills and scattered villages. But that calm surface hides the shattered remnants of a catastrophic eruption. At some point in the first millennium, Ilopango blew itself apart in an event so large it buried vast areas of Mesoamerica under meters of ash. Archaeologists working in the region call the ash blanket Tierra Blanca Joven, the young white earth. To the people who lived through it, it may have felt like the end of the world. When scientists first tried to date the Ilopango eruption, the numbers were imprecise. Radiocarbon estimates placed it somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries, roughly the right neighborhood, roughly the right magnitude. A caldera-forming eruption of that size could easily loft sulfur into the stratosphere. It seemed perfectly capable of blocking out the sun. For a while, Ilopango looked like the answer. A catastrophic eruption in the Christian era, big enough to explain the darkness, sitting in a region that later endured social and demographic upheavals. It fit the story, or at least it could be made to fit. But nature doesn't care about plausible narratives. It cares about physics and timing. As dating techniques improved, the Ilopango window narrowed. Tephra, volcanic ash, from the eruption was found in lake sediments and archaeological layers that could be tied down more precisely. The most recent studies suggest Ilopango's great outburst probably happened a little later than 536, more likely in the 540s. Still within the broader crisis period, still potentially devastating, but slightly out of step with the first, sudden plunge into darkness. That doesn't clear Ilopango entirely. It might have contributed to the prolonged misery of the decade. It may very well have been one of the blows that kept the climate from recovering. But it no longer looks like the solitary trigger. The volcano that first blotted out the sun might lie elsewhere. So researchers turned back to the ice. Those Greenland and Antarctic cores don't just show that an eruption happened. They capture its chemical fingerprint. Volcanic ash and sulfate carry trace amounts of elements and isotopes that depend on where the magma originated. The mantle beneath Central America doesn't look chemically like the mantle beneath Iceland or Alaska or Kamchatka. Each volcanic province leaves a slightly different signature. When scientists looked closely at the 536 sulfate spike in Greenland, they noticed something important. The chemistry didn't match typical tropical eruptions like Tambora. Instead, it looks more like high-latitude basaltic systems. In other words, the eruption responsible for the first pulse of darkness probably came from the higher northern latitudes, somewhere around the North Atlantic or Arctic fringe. Immediately, another volcanic suspect stepped into the spotlight. Iceland. In the 6th century, Iceland as we know it may not even have existed in its present form, but the volcanic systems that would become Iceland were already active. This region sits on a hotspot and a plate boundary, a perfect recipe for massive eruptions. We know that later Icelandic events like Laki in 1783 could produce veil-like hazes and severe cooling across Europe. So when the ice core chemistry suggested a northern source, many eyes turned to those subglacial volcanoes in the North Atlantic. Other high-latitude sites are possible too. Some geologists have proposed North American volcanoes, perhaps in the Cascades or the Aleutian Arc. The chemical match isn't perfect enough to pinpoint a single crater. The eruption that dimmed the sun might even have come from a volcano now largely eroded, or hidden beneath ice, or drowned beneath the sea. For a long time, this was as far as the story went. A big high-latitude eruption in 536 from somewhere in the northern hemisphere, and a general sense that something else happened around 540. But the details were fuzzy. Then, around 2015, the picture sharpened. A new generation of ice core studies brought ultra-precise techniques to bear on those mid-6th century layers. Instead of slicing the ice into chunky segments spanning multiple years, researchers began peeling it back almost year by year, like pages in a frozen diary. They used sophisticated mass spectrometers to measure trace elements in parts per trillion. They cross-checked the volcanic sulfate with tiny shards of volcanic glass, microtephra, embedded in the ice. The results were startlingly clear. The 536 event, the one that darkened the sun and chilled the summers immediately, showed a fingerprint pointing to a high-latitude northern hemisphere eruption, very likely in the North Atlantic region, with Iceland or a Proto-Icelandic system high on the list. Then, just a few years later, around 540, the ice recorded another spike. This one was different. Its chemistry pointed not to the high latitudes but to the tropics. In other words, the world may not have been struck by a single volcanic catastrophe, but by two. A northern eruption in 536 that started the volcanic winter, then a tropical eruption around 540 that recharged the stratospheric veil just as it was beginning to thin. This 1-2 punch model explains a lot. A single great eruption can cool the climate for 2 to 3 years before the aerosols gradually settle out. That's roughly what we saw after Tambora. A year or two of extreme anomalies, then a return toward normal. The 6th century, by contrast, shows a longer, more drawn-out suppression. Narrow tree rings not just in 536 and 537, but again after 540. Historical sources describing strange weather and poor harvests not for 1 year, but for much of a decade. If the atmosphere was still struggling to clear the sulfates from the 536 eruption, when a second major blast pumped in fresh sulfur around 540, the cooling would be extended and intensified. Oceans that had begun to reabsorb heat would be checked. Growing seasons already shortened would be cut again. Populations whose grain stores were depleted by the first blow would be confronted with renewed failure before they had time to recover. From the ground, it would not feel like a pair of discrete events. It would feel like a single, long, malicious season that wouldn't end. For peasants and emperors alike, the sky would simply remain wrong. Somewhere behind that wrongness, volcanoes were tearing themselves apart. One probably near the North Atlantic, another somewhere in the tropics, perhaps in Central America, perhaps in Indonesia, perhaps along the great volcanic arcs that ring the equator. Ilopango may or may not have been part of that sequence. Other candidates have been proposed. None have yet been proven beyond doubt, and that is where the mystery stands. We can say with high confidence that major eruptions occurred in 536 and around 540. We can say the first likely came from the high northern latitudes and the second from the tropics. We can trace their atmospheric fingerprints in ice, watch their shadows pass through tree rings, and see their consequences unfold in famine and plague and political crisis. What we cannot do, at least not yet, is point to a single crater and say, here. Here is where the sun went out. The evidence is growing. New cores, new dating methods, new analyses of ash layers in distant lakes and bogs are slowly tightening the net. One day we may know the exact volcanoes responsible, or we may discover that the story is even more complex, a cluster of eruptions, a chorus rather than a solo. For now the culprits remain half hidden. Names like Ilopango, Iceland, and distant drowned volcanic ridges hover around the edges of the story. The Earth keeps most of its secrets buried, but the consequences of those hidden eruptions did not stay buried. They spilled into human lives, into empty granaries and crowded graveyards. And as the sky stayed dim and the cold lingered, another killer began to move along the trade routes of the darkened world. By the time those eruptions had finished loading the sky with dust, the real catastrophe was already taking shape on the ground. Darkness and cold are unsettling, but for most people in 536, the horror arrived in a much more familiar form. Hunger. Grain doesn't care about volcanic aerosols or sulfate spikes. It cares about sunlight and temperature and the timing of the rains. In the years after 536, all three went wrong at once. Across Europe, the harvest cycle that had ticked along for generations suddenly became unreliable. Spring came late, or not at all. Summer days never quite warmed. Frost crept back over fields that should have been greening. Wheat and barley pushed up weak, stunted shoots, then yellowed before seed formed. Vines failed to flower. Fruit trees produced blossoms that withered in cold, damp air. In the Mediterranean heartlands of empire, where Roman granaries had once overflowed, chroniclers began to notice a pattern. Sowing and reaping no longer matched the calendar. In Constantinople, officials complained that the annona, the grain tax that fed the capital, was delivered in short measure. Ships still came, but their holds were not as full. Egypt, the old breadbasket, struggled with floods that were mistimed and muted. The Nile's rhythm nudged out of sync by subtle changes in climate. North African estates reported poor yields. The delicate system that had kept urban populations fed loosened, then frayed. Far to the north, in lands that had never known Roman roads or imperial tax collectors, the cold bit even harder. In Scandinavia and the British Isles, agriculture was already a tight negotiation with the climate. Short growing seasons, marginal soils. People there depended on a few precious months of warmth to ripen their grain. After 536, those months shrank. Pollen records and tree rings from Norway and Sweden tell the same story as the Mediterranean chronicles, but in a different language. A sudden drop in growth, a pause in forest expansion, a hint of fields being abandoned. Archaeologists see farmsteads that go quiet, settlements that contract, burial grounds that swell. In Britain, later legend would remember this era as a time when kings rose and fell with strange speed, when communities moved, when fortifications were strengthened. The texts do not always say famine. They don't have to. It is there between the lines, in references to raiding for cattle, in sudden shifts in power, in monasteries taking in the hungry and desperate. In Ireland the record is starker. Irish monks, patient and laconic, kept annals that tracked years by brief notations, battles, successions, eclipses. In the late 530s, their steady script records something else. Anni Famis, years of famine. One entry speaks simply of a failure of bread stretching from 536 to 539. No drama, no elaboration, just the bare fact that for 3 or 4 years in a row, the staple that gave life to the island's people did not come through. A failure of bread sounds almost abstract. In reality, it meant families watching oat and barley fields lie thin and pale. It meant milk yields dropping as pastures browned. It meant cauldrons filled with increasingly watery porridge, then with roots and weeds, then with nothing. When you read that line in the annals, you're hearing the echo of children crying from hunger 15 centuries ago. The cold did not stop at Europe's edge. On the other side of Eurasia, Chinese chroniclers were watching the sky with their own careful attention. In the official histories of the Northern Way and the short-lived dynasties that followed it, the mid-6th century appears as a time of strange weather and mounting disaster. Records speak of frosts in summer, of untimely snow, of droughts that came when the land should have been soaked. Crops failed in the Yellow River basin. In some regions, locusts arrived to finish what the climate had started, stripping what little vegetation survived the cold. The texts describe people eating each other, a phrase Chinese histories use soberly when famine passed a certain threshold, when bark and grasses and animal skins had already been consumed, and human bodies became the final, terrible resource. As yields collapsed, people moved. Tax registers show villages emptying, households vanishing from the rolls as families abandoned their land and drifted towards cities, temples, river crossings, anywhere that might offer charity or work or access to stored grain. Banditry rose. Local strongmen hoarded food and leveraged it into power. Officials complained they could no longer collect enough tax to pay troops or maintain granaries. Climate doesn't overthrow dynasties by itself, but when the harvests fail, the political fabric thins. Promises that once felt solid, that the emperor could ensure heaven's favour, that the state could keep granaries full, begin to sound hollow when the bowls are empty. On the far side of the world, in the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica, the sky may have been dim for a different reason, but the effect was similar. If Ilopango's great eruption did occur in the 540s, as many studies now suggest, it would have been a catastrophe almost beyond imagining for the Maya communities living around it. Thick ash would have buried fields, poisoned water, collapsed roofs. Even regions spared direct fallout would have suffered from altered rainfall patterns and smoky, obscured skies. Archaeologists tracing the Tierra Blanca Hoven ash layer see its imprint under abandoned villages, over once fertile fields, in river valleys choked with sediments. In the decades that follow, settlement patterns in parts of the Maya lowlands shift. Some centres decline abruptly, others grow as refugees and survivors cluster in new places. Trade routes seem to reorient, as if commerce and people alike were flowing around a scar in the landscape, We don't have written Maya accounts for this exact period, at least none that have survived, but we can infer the human texture. Maize kernels planted into dust that never quite wet, milpers drowned under ash, sacred calendars disrupted when the rains failed their appointed days, priests performing rituals to coax Chak, the rain god, back to a sky that remained strangely veiled. Across all these regions, from Ireland to China to El Salvador, famine did more than empty stomachs. It hollowed out the foundations of authority. Pre-modern rulers based their legitimacy on an implicit bargain. They claimed a special relationship with the divine, with heaven, with the ancestors. In return, they were expected to keep order, repel invaders, and most of all ensure the land remained fruitful. When the sun dimmed and the grain failed year after year, that bargain cracked. In Constantinople, Justinian could order processions and prayers, but he could not make the clouds part. In Chinese courts, astrologers could reinterpret omens, but they could not magic away frost-bitten seedlings. In Maya city-states, rulers could bleed and burn incense on towering pyramids, yet still watch their people drift away, following rumours of unburied fields elsewhere. Hungry populations become restless. They stop paying taxes. They question edicts. They gather around charismatic leaders who promise food, or around old gods who seem newly powerful. Bandit chiefs, millenarian prophets, local warlords, all thrive in the cracks hunger creates. But the political stories, the shifting borders and changing dynasties, can sometimes obscure the quieter, harsher reality experienced in kitchens and fields. Imagine the rhythm of an ordinary farming year before 536. The comfort of routines learned from parents and grandparents. You know roughly when to plough, when to sow, when to expect the first green shoots, when to plan the harvest feast. Your life is shaped by seasons as reliable as breathing. Then the sky goes wrong. At first it is just a strange haze, a dimness. Days feel like they're permanently late afternoon. Shadows are softer. You put the seed in the ground anyway. What else can you do? Maybe the weather will right itself. But the air remains chill. Rains come at odd times, drizzling when they should pour, stopping when the soil still feels dry. You wait for the plants to thicken, but they don't. Heads of grain stay small. You walk the fields and your stomach knots with a new kind of fear. Harvest comes, and it is thin. You tighten rations. You mix more chaff into the flour, more water into the stew. You sell a few animals to buy extra grain, telling yourself next year will be better, and then next year is worse. By the second or third failed harvest, your world has narrowed to a few basic calculations. How much food is left? How long it might last? Who eats and who doesn't? Children, who once tumbled in the fields, move more slowly. Their faces sharpen. Coughs linger. Old people volunteer to take smaller portions. Pregnant women miscarry. Arguments break out over handfuls of grain, over who stole whose turnip, over why the gods are angry and whose sin is to blame. Night brings its own torments. You lie awake, listening to your own stomach growl, listening to the wind grind dust against the walls, wondering if the dim sun you saw sink behind the horizon will bother to rise tomorrow. Multiply that feeling by millions of lives, stretched across continents. That is what the volcanic winter of the 530s meant in practice. Not just a curious note in a climate record, but a slow, grinding pressure that weighed on every human decision. And into this weakened, hungry world something else was moving. Something microscopic, riding in the bodies of rats and fleas and travellers. As the granaries emptied and the people clustered in cities and camps, a new kind of death was about to arrive. The first confirmed blow landed in 541. Somewhere in Egypt, along the crowded grain routes of the Nile Delta, people began to notice something new. Not just the thin faces and hollow eyes of hunger they'd grown used to over the past few years, but swellings. Hard, painful lumps bubbled up in armpits and groins, under jaws and along necks. Fever followed. Delirium. Then, very often, silence. From there, the sickness rode the same paths that had once carried life to the Mediterranean world. Barges up the Nile, coastal ships along the Levantine shore, merchant vessels loaded with what grain they could find, heading for the imperial capital that still thought of itself as Rome's rightful heir. Historians would later name it after the man who sat on the throne at the time, the Plague of Justinian. But the real protagonist wasn't an emperor or a general or a saint. It was a bacterium. Modern science calls it Yersinia pestis. Under a microscope it looks like a short, plump rod. To the people of the 6th century it was invisible. All they saw were the consequences. Fever that rose like a tide, blackened extremities, bleeding under the skin, and those terrible swollen buboes that gave one form of the disease its later name. If that sounds familiar, there's a reason. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA from 6th century graves has shown that the Plague of Justinian was caused by the very same species of pathogen that would explode across Eurasia in the 14th century as the Black Death. 2 different pandemics, separated by 800 years, linked by a common microscopic ancestor. Why then? Why there? Why, after centuries of relative epidemiological calm, did this particular horror emerge just a few years after the sky dimmed and the harvests failed? Researchers are still piecing together the chain of causation, but patterns are beginning to emerge. Yersinia pestis is a disease of rodents before it is a disease of humans. It circulates among wild rodent populations, especially certain species of ground squirrels, marmots, and gerbils, maintained by fleas that bite, feed, and jump hosts. Most of the time, these natural reservoirs exist in rough equilibrium. Animals die, others live, the bacteria keep circulating quietly in the background. Climate disruption can upset that balance. When temperatures shift and rainfall patterns change, rodent populations boom or crash. In some regions, better conditions for grasses and seeds can produce explosions of rodents. In others, drought and cold can drive hungry animals out of their usual burrows, pushing them closer to human settlements and to the commensal rats that thrive in our granaries and garbage piles. The 6th century climate shock seems to have done both, in different places at different times. Studies of Central Asian climate proxies suggest that the years around 536 were marked by sharp swings in moisture and temperature. That kind of variability is a gift to a pathogen. Stressed ecosystems, overabundant hosts one year, starving, migrating hosts the next. Somewhere in that shifting mosaic, Yersinia pestis made a crucial jump. From its wild reservoir into black rats that rode grain ships, temple granaries, and city sewers. From there, it only needed people, and people in the 540s were uniquely vulnerable. Years of marginal harvest had already worn down immune systems. Malnourished bodies fight infections poorly. Bone chemistry from cemeteries spanning this period shows signs of nutritional stress. Lines in teeth, and skeletons that record episodes of hunger during childhood. Children who grew up in the shadow of the dim sun carried that frailty into adulthood. On top of that, the social map of the Mediterranean had been rearranged by famine. As rural yields faltered, populations had flowed into cities, into refugee camps, into fortified towns. Displaced people collected around granaries, monasteries, and military supply depots, places where food, even in reduced amounts, was still being distributed. Cities like Constantinople. By 541, Constantinople was a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people. A knot of stone and timber wrapped around the Golden Horn, its streets threaded with aqueducts and colonnades, its harbours jammed with ships bringing in grain, oil and wine from across the empire. It was also, once Plague arrived, the perfect petri dish. Procopius, the court historian who watched this unfold, left a description that still chills across the centuries. He writes of a sickness that seemed to come from nowhere, touching rich and poor alike, of people who went to bed healthy and woke with a fever and a lump under the arm, of households in which all the domestics were attacked by the disease, while others were left alone, contrary to all expectation. He speaks of corpses lying unburied in the streets, of bodies stacked in churches when graveyards could take no more, of the state finally commandeering towers along the old city walls to use as mass tombs, filling them with layer upon layer of the dead. At the height of the outbreak, some writers claim that 10,000 people died each day in Constantinople alone. Modern historians are cautious about such numbers. Ancient chroniclers liked round, dramatic figures. But even if we halve or quarter them, we are still looking at a mortality event on a scale hard to grasp. Imagine the sound of it. Not as a sudden catastrophe, like an earthquake or a battle, but as a steady drumbeat. Day after day, carts creaking under the weight of bodies, the splash of corpses being tipped into hastily dug trenches, the murmured prayers of priests who had no time to finish one funeral rite before being called to the next. Procopius notes an eerie social effect. With so many dying, patterns of fear broke down. People stopped avoiding the sick, not because they understood contagion, but because the sheer ubiquity of the disease made caution feel pointless. Carers nursed relatives despite knowing, on some level, what that might mean. Gravediggers handled corpses until they themselves collapsed. Across the empire and beyond, the plague did not pass in a single wave. It receded, returned, and receded again, in pulses that stretched over 2 centuries. Egypt, Syria, Italy, North Africa, the Balkans, even up into Gaul, and perhaps beyond. Some regions may have escaped, others were hit repeatedly. Ports and trade hubs, plugged into the circulatory system of Mediterranean commerce, tended to fare worst. Total mortality is impossible to calculate with certainty. Estimates range from 25 to 50 million deaths across the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world between the 540s and the 750s. In some cities, perhaps a third to half the population vanished in a matter of months. In rural districts already thinned by famine, entire villages disappeared from the record, leaving only collapsed walls and silent fields. For the people living through it, it must have felt like the world was being squeezed in a vice. First, the sky dimmed and the crops failed. That was the first hammer. Slow, grinding, impersonal. It struck everyone, but it hit the poor hardest, as hunger always does. Then, just as some regions were beginning to find a fragile new balance, planting hardier grains, tightening belts, adjusting to shorter growing seasons, the second hammer fell. Swift, invisible, targeted not at the fields but at the bodies that worked them. The two blows amplified each other. Famine made plague deadlier. Plague made famine worse. Fewer hands were left to plough, to harvest, to transport food. Surviving farmers abandoned marginal plots that no longer seemed worth the risk. Trade shrank as merchants died or stayed home, as towns lost the surplus that made markets possible. In a more prosperous, well-fed world, Yersinia pestis might still have caused a serious epidemic. In the exhausted, calorie-starved societies of the 540s and 550s, it became an existential threat. To the people of the time, of course, this was not a story about bacteria and climate forcing. It was a story about wrath and omen and fate. Some said God was punishing Justinian for his wars and his theological policies. Others thought it was a test or a sign of the world's approaching end. Apocalyptic texts circulated. Astrologers and priests searched the dim sky for patterns, that could make sense of the death that now seemed to seep from every alley. They were not entirely wrong to link the heavens and the pestilence. The chain of causation was more complex than they could know, but the connection was real. Ash and aerosols high in the stratosphere had cooled the earth, jostled the monsoons, shifted the habitats of rats and fleas. Years later, in a crowded harbour, a single infected flea found its way onto the sleeve of a man unloading grain. From there, the line leads directly to mass graves outside city walls. Plague did not kill the Roman Empire by itself, nor did the volcanic winter, but together they warped the demographic and economic foundations on which that empire and its rivals rested. The next part of the story is about those foundations cracking, about armies that could no longer recruit enough soldiers, treasuries that could not be refilled, frontiers that became porous, and belief systems that strained to explain why heaven's favour seemed to have withdrawn. As the bodies were carried out of Constantinople and Cairo and Antioch, something else was being carried away with them, the old world sense of stability. When Justinian came to power in 527, he did not see himself as a caretaker of a shrinking world. He saw himself as a restorer. In his mind, the old Roman Empire had not died in 476 when the last Western emperor was deposed. It had simply retreated to Constantinople, waiting for a strong enough hand to knit it all back together. Justinian believed he was that hand. He had grand plans to match, law codes to systematize centuries of Roman jurisprudence, church councils to settle theological disputes, monuments like Hagia Sophia to proclaim imperial glory in stone and light, and above all reconquest. North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, perhaps in time even Spain and Gaul. Those campaigns began well. In 533 his general Belisarius sailed to Africa and, against the odds, crushed the Vandal kingdom in a matter of months. The rich grain lands of Carthage, once the breadbasket of Rome, were back under imperial control. A few years later, imperial armies were fighting their way up the Italian peninsula, seizing city after city from Gothic hands. On paper, it looked like the old Roman world might really be coming back. Then the sky dimmed. Volcanic winter did something subtle but relentless to Justinian's project. It attacked the invisible infrastructure that any empire depends on: tax receipts, population, and time. The Roman state lived on grain. Peasant farmers sowed and harvested. Tax collectors took a share in kind or coin, and that surplus fed the cities and the army. When harvests shrank, so did the river of resources flowing toward Constantinople. We have tax papyri from Egypt, once the empire's most reliable source of grain and revenue, recording remissions and arrears in the years after 536. Fields lay fallow. Villages could not pay. The imperial government, recognizing reality, sometimes cancelled debts or reduced assessments. That sounds compassionate, and perhaps it was. But it also meant less gold in the treasury, fewer ships loaded with wheat heading north. At the same time, the population base was eroding. Famine culls quietly. It doesn't always leave dramatic mass graves. Instead, it shows up as missing names in census lists, as abandoned hamlets, as smaller families. Then, just as this slow demographic leak was underway, Plague ripped a jagged hole through the remaining fabric. Armies don't fight on ambition alone. They need recruits, officers, pack animals, smiths, carpenters, sailors, all drawn from the same shrinking pool of people trying to survive failed harvests and recurrent disease. By the 540s and 550s, imperial commanders in Italy were constantly writing back to Constantinople, asking for reinforcements and money. What they got more and more often was delay, orders to economize, instructions to negotiate instead of fight. The dream of a unified Mediterranean empire did not shatter overnight. It frayed. Fortresses that had been painstakingly captured from the Goths were left under-garrisoned. Roads were no longer properly maintained. Salaries for soldiers and officials arrived late or not at all, breeding discontent and corruption. In North Africa, Berber groups pushed into territories that imperial troops could no longer effectively patrol. In Italy, the Gothic wars dragged on far longer than Justinian had expected, turning fertile regions into depopulated battlefields just as climate and disease were biting hardest. From a distance of 15 centuries, we can trace the outlines of a pattern. The volcanic dimming weakened the economic base. The plague slashed the labour force. Justinian's overextension magnified both. By the time he died in 565, his conquests technically remained in imperial hands. But they were fragile, underpopulated, and expensive to hold. Across the eastern frontier, the Sassanid Empire, Rome's great rival in Persia, was walking a parallel path. The Sassanids were not a minor kingdom. They were a sophisticated state with monumental cities, intricate irrigation systems, and a powerful military aristocracy. Their shahs saw themselves as heirs to Cyrus and Darius, guardians of an ancient imperial tradition that matched Rome's in pride and scope. They too depended on predictable climate and dense agricultural populations, canal systems in Mesopotamia, fields in Iran, highland pastures feeding cavalry horses. The same dimmed sun that chilled Constantinople chilled Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital. The same disruptions to rainfall and growing seasons pressed on Persian farmers, and the same plague reached their cities along caravan routes and river traffic. Sources for 6th century Persia are thinner than for the Roman world, but what we have suggests serious strain. Tax reforms aimed at shoring up revenue, religious tensions, internal rebellions. Wars with Justinian, especially over the Caucasus and Mesopotamian borderlands, added another layer of stress. Two wounded giants leaning against each other, each trying to gain leverage while their foundations shook. Neither empire collapsed immediately, but the damage lingered. A century later, when a new religious and political force surged out of Arabia under the banner of Islam, both the Eastern Roman and Sassanid states were still visibly marked by the shocks of the 6th century. The Sassanid Empire, in particular, would crumble with astonishing speed in the face of Arab armies. Historians debate exactly how much of that vulnerability can be traced back to 536 and its aftermath, but it is hard to avoid the sense that a century of demographic and economic erosion had hollowed out what once seemed unshakable. Far to the north, beyond the imperial frontiers, another story was unfolding in forests and fjords. In Scandinavia, the years around 536 show up in the ground. Pollen cores from lakes and bogs record abrupt changes in vegetation. Less evidence of cereal cultivation, more signs of abandoned fields growing over. Archaeologists excavating 6th century settlements find houses left empty and never reoccupied. In some regions, the density of known sites drops sharply. It's as if entire districts thinned out or moved. There are also the gold hoards. From Denmark to Sweden, people in the migration period seem to have buried large quantities of gold, arm rings, pendants, coins, during the 6th century. Not all treasure hoards are mysterious. Many are simply hidden wealth that owners plan to retrieve. But these particular caches, often carefully deposited and never recovered, look less like savings accounts and more like offerings. Imagine a chieftain watching his livestock die in the snow, his fields fail year after year, the sun itself hanging pale and weak in the sky. His priests and seers have no easy answers. In desperation, he takes his most precious objects, symbols of status and prosperity, and consigns them to the earth or the bog, asking whatever powers rule the weather to take notice. Some scholars have suggested a cultural echo of this catastrophe in later Norse myth. In the Icelandic sagas and the poetic Edda, compiled centuries afterward, there is a story of Fimbulwinter, a mighty winter that precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world. 3 successive winters with no summers in between. Snow driven from all directions, brothers turning on brothers, a world sliding into chaos before the final battle of gods and monsters. We can't prove that this legend preserves a memory of the 6th century climate event. Oral traditions shift, merge and rework material across generations, but the resonance is hard to ignore. An extraordinary winter, social breakdown, the sense that cosmic order itself has failed. While Scandinavian societies weathered the storm and eventually entered the Viking Age, the 6th century downturn seems to have marked a deep rupture. Population dipped, power structures reconfigured, new centres rose where old ones faltered. Something similar was happening in the lands between the empires, the broad zones of Eastern and Central Europe that connected the Baltic to the Balkans and the steppes to the Danube. Before 536, this region was already in motion. Germanic groups had pushed into Roman territories during the earlier migration period. Huns had carved out a short-lived empire. Populations were shuffling. Borders were porous. The climate shock and its economic fallout added another layer of instability. Steppe nomads who depended on pasture found their grasses unreliable. Farmers along river valleys faced the same harvest failures seen elsewhere. Groups moved, looking for better land, better terms, or weaker neighbours. Into this ferment came new players, the Avars, a nomadic confederation of steppe warriors, and expanding Slavic groups moving south and west. The Avars arrived in Europe in the mid-6th century, just as Justinian's state was struggling with plague and war. They established themselves in the Carpathian Basin, in what is now roughly Hungary and its surroundings, creating a powerful khaganate that would dominate Central Europe for 2 centuries. To their south and east, Slavic communities spread into the depopulated or weakened territories along the Danube and the Balkans. Byzantine sources from the later 6th and 7th centuries speak anxiously of Slavic raids, settlements, and the gradual Slavicization of regions that had once been firmly under Roman control. Was this solely because of the year 536? No. Migrations and invasions have many causes: political opportunities, internal dynamics, long-term demographic trends. But the climatic and epidemiological shocks of the mid-6th century clearly helped create power vacuums. Fortified cities that might once have repelled raiders were half empty and underfunded. Local elites who might have organised resistance were dead, displaced, or reduced in stature. In this sense, the fall of empires was not always a dramatic toppling of capitals. It was a gradual redrawing of who could project power where. Old systems sagged, new groups slipped into the gaps. This is why some modern historians like Michael McCormick have suggested that if we're going to look for a true beginning of the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, we might do better to point not to 476, with its tidy textbook symbolism, but to 536. 476 was, in many ways, a political rebranding. The Western imperial title disappeared, but Roman institutions, laws, and economic structures persisted under new Germanic rulers. Cities still functioned. Long-distance trade still moved. The sun still shone. The mid-6th century, by contrast, brought something deeper, a synchronized shock that rippled from Ireland to Iran. Climate, harvests, disease, demography, war, all entangled. The cumulative effect was not just a change in which elite wore the crown, but a transformation in what kinds of societies Europe and the Near East could support. Population shrank. Literacy rates dipped in many regions. Monumental building slowed or stopped. Coinage became rarer in some hinterlands as market networks contracted. Yet even dark ages is a misleading phrase. Darkness suggests emptiness, a lack of history. The reality is more complex. These were centuries of adaptation and creativity as well as loss. People adjusted to shorter growing seasons with new crops and techniques. New languages and identities coalesced from the mingling of migrants and locals. Religious ideas shifted, seeking to explain why heaven had allowed such suffering. Under the dimmed sun of 536 and its aftermath, an old world cracked, but the fragments did not vanish. They recombined slowly into the medieval world that would follow, and as they did, memories of the darkness, of failed harvests and empty villages, of plague carts and buried gold seeped into chronicles, into legends, into the stories people told each other on long winter nights. Those echoes are where we turn next. If you live through a time when the sun fades and the seasons break, you don't just forget. You might not write it down in a chronicle. You might not know the word volcano or aerosols or climate forcing. But you will tell stories. You will tell them to your children, and they to theirs. And over centuries those stories will shift and twist and gather new details. Gods will be added. Heroes will appear. Morals will be attached. Yet somewhere under all the layers the bones of memory remain. In the north, one of those memories may have become a legend of the end of the world. We touched already on Fimbul Winter, the great winter of Norse myth. It appears in sources written down in Iceland around the 13th century, but those tales claim to reach back into an older Scandinavian oral tradition. Fimbul Winter is not just a cold snap. It is 3 winters in a row with no summers in between, snow blown from every direction, bitter winds, crops failing, animals dying, social bonds unravelling, brothers turning on brothers, parents on children. Only after this unending winter does Ragnarok come, the final battle, the drowning of the world, the death and rebirth of the cosmos. From the standpoint of physics, 3 literal years without summer is not what happened in 536. The dimming seems to have lasted more than a year, and the wider climatic downturn stretched across decades, with cold spells recurring into the 540s. Summers existed, but they were shorter, cooler, less reliable. The Earth did not freeze solid, but oral tradition doesn't deal in precise climate graphs. It deals in impressions, in the feeling that the seasons have broken, that normality has ended. Add 6 or 7 centuries of retelling, and you can imagine how inherited stories of failed harvests and strange skies might merge with older Indo-European motifs of cyclical destruction, with warrior ideals, with Christian apocalyptic ideas filtering north, until they crystallize into the myth of Fimbul Winter. We cannot prove that connection. Many scholars are cautious, and rightly so. Myths are magpies. They steal shiny pieces from everywhere, but the coincidence is tempting. Gold hoards buried in the 500s and 30s and 500s and 40s, abandoned farms, sudden demographic dips, and centuries later, a story of a winter so long it feels like the end of days. Further west, in the mist-soaked islands of Britain, another set of stories was taking shape. When people today hear King Arthur, they often think of knights in plate armour, round tables and courtly love, but the earliest layers of the Arthurian tradition are much darker and harder to pin down. Some historians place a possible historical Arthur, if he existed at all, in the late 5th or early 6th century, a Romano-British war leader fighting Saxon incursions in a world where Roman administration had receded but not entirely vanished. By the time the volcanic haze of 536 rolled in, Britain was already a patchwork of competing kingdoms and cultures. The climate shock and ensuing famines would have hit that fragile landscape hard. Later Arthurian tales, especially in their medieval French and English forms, include a recurring motif, the wasteland. A king is wounded, often in the thigh or groin, a symbolic blow to fertility. His land becomes sterile, rivers dry up or flood unpredictably. Fields will not bear grain, animals fail to thrive. The entire kingdom is trapped in a kind of spiritual and ecological stasis until a hero arrives, asks the right question, or finds the right relic, and healing can begin. Some scholars have looked at this motif and wondered if it might echo 6th century reality. Chieftains presiding over depopulated territories, ruined harvests, and the sense that the land itself has fallen under a curse. Again, it is speculation. The wasteland also fits into older Celtic patterns of sacred kingship, where the health of the ruler and the fertility of the land are linked. It may reflect purely moral concerns, the idea that sin or injustice pollutes society. But set those stories against the backdrop of tree ring evidence showing cold, stunted growth in British oaks in the 530s, against archaeology suggesting abandoned hill forts and shifting settlement patterns, against a sky that, for a time, really did seem to withdraw its blessing, and the wasteland begins to sound less like pure allegory and more like memory mythologized. The earlier surviving Welsh poetry may carry similar shadows. One of the most famous early Welsh texts, Ye Gododin, is a long elegy for warriors who died at the Battle of Cattraeth, probably around the late 6th or early 7th century. On the surface, it is a heroic lament, praise for courage, grief for slaughtered friends, bitterness toward cowardice and betrayal. But embedded in that and other early poems are hints of a world in flux. There are references to burning halls, shattered alliances, rulers whose generosity, measured in feasts and cattle, has failed. Later Welsh tradition remembers the Age of Arthur as a time of constant war, shifting loyalties and strange portents. We have to be careful. Those poems were copied and recopied centuries after they were first composed. Lines were added, glosses woven in. It is almost impossible to draw a straight line from a specific stanza to a specific foggy year in the 530s. Yet taken together, Norse Fimbulwinter, Arthur's Wasteland, Welsh laments of ruin and dislocation, they suggest that in the far corners of post-Roman Europe, people framed social and environmental breakdown in terms of cosmic disorder. When the grain failed, it was not just bad luck. It was a sign that the world's deep rules had been violated. On the other side of Eurasia, where empires were older and writing more stable, the response took a different form. In the Buddhist world of East Asia, there was already a concept ready to be invoked in times of trouble, Mofa in Chinese or Mappo in Japanese, the age of the decline of the Dharma. According to some strands of Buddhist thought, history unfolds in 3 broad phases after the Buddha's lifetime. The age of the true Dharma, when teachings are correctly understood and practice is strong. The age of semblance Dharma, when forms remain but depth fades. And finally the age of decline, when the teachings are misunderstood, institutions are corrupt, and human capacities for enlightenment have withered. By the 6th century, Chinese Buddhist texts were increasingly preoccupied with this idea of degeneration. Political fragmentation after the fall of the Han Dynasty, invasions by steppe peoples, and internal rebellions had already primed people to see their era as one of moral and cosmic downturn. Then came strange skies and erratic harvests. Chinese and Korean chronicles from the 530s and 540s record unusual atmospheric phenomena, dim suns, persistent hazes, frosts at odd times. They do not connect these directly to a single volcanic event. That concept did not exist for them, but they fold the anomalies into a broader narrative of heaven sending signs, of an era slipping morally and cosmologically off balance. In such a mood, the rhetoric of Mofa found fertile ground. If the fields no longer behaved as they should, Perhaps it was because human beings had drifted away from the Dharma, because the cosmos had entered a darker age in its long cycle. This is one of the ways human beings cope with unexplained catastrophe, by embedding it in an existing story of decline. Around the Mediterranean, a different apocalyptic script was available. Early Christianity had always carried a strong current of expectation. In the first centuries after Jesus, many believers thought the second coming might arrive within their lifetimes. As years rolled by and the world stubbornly continued, theologians wrestled with delay, reinterpreting prophecies, emphasizing the unknowable timing of the end. But the 6th century brought a new wave of crisis thinking. When the sun dimmed, bishops wrote sermons about signs and wonders. When the plague arrived, killing tens of thousands in Constantinople and beyond, many Christians reached for the language of revelation, horsemen, pestilence, judgment. We hear echoes of this in homilies and letters, preachers urging repentance, fasting and processions, emperors sponsoring ever more elaborate relic cults, hoping to marshal saintly power against disease and drought. Lay people commissioning apotropaic charms and inscribed crosses, not just as expressions of piety, but as spiritual armour in a world that seemed to be unravelling. It would be an exaggeration to say that Justinian's plague single-handedly turned Mediterranean Christianity apocalyptic. End-time expectations had ebbed and flowed for centuries, but the sequence of dim sky, bad harvests and lethal epidemic gave those expectations fresh force. You can see it in architecture and art as well. Mosaics from the later 6th and 7th centuries often emphasize Christ as Pantocrator, ruler of all, gazing out in stern judgment from domes and apses. The message is clear. History is not random. Someone is in charge. Someone will call the ledger due. And what about the many societies touched by the 6th century cooling that left no chronicles at all? The farmers along Baltic shores who never learned to write Latin or runes. The herders in the Alps, the villagers in the Carpathians, the fishing communities along subarctic coasts. Their memories do not come to us in words but in patterns in the ground. Archaeologists see abrupt changes in burial practices in the decades after 536. Graves that were once richly furnished with weapons and jewellery become simpler, poorer. In some regions, cemeteries shift location entirely. Old sacred sites, hilltops with long histories of ritual deposition, springs where offerings had been made for generations, fall out of use. New ones appear elsewhere. Sometimes ritual deposits increase rather than vanish. In bogs and lakes, people cast in weapons, tools, even whole boats and wagons. Not as casual trash, but carefully. Spearheads bent, swords broken, objects arranged. Acts that look very much like offerings to unseen powers, perhaps asking for the return of normal seasons, or thanking the spirits when, at last, the worst seemed to pass. In other areas, house remains tell their own story. Longhouses shrink in size as extended families break into smaller units, or resources no longer support large households. Storage pits proliferate, an architectural response to new insecurity, as if people were saying, "We cannot trust next year, we must hoard what we can." Taken together, these are the myths of non-literate societies. Not myths in the sense of spoken tales which are gone, but myths in action. Behaviours that assume a world where invisible forces must be placated, where catastrophe has a cause and can perhaps be influenced. When you step back, a pattern emerges across continents. In Scandinavia, an endless winter before the end of all things. In Britain, a wounded king whose land has become a barren waste. In Wales, songs of ruined halls and broken loyalties. In China and Korea, a deepening preoccupation with living in an age of Dharma's decline. In the Christian Mediterranean, sermons thick with images of judgment and apocalypse. Among peoples without writing, new offerings in bogs, new ways of burying the dead, old shrines abandoned for reasons no text explains. These are not neat one-to-one records of what happened in 536. They are not diaries of ash clouds and temperature curves. They are instead humanity's way of folding shock into story. The sun dimmed for a time. The world grew colder. Empires faltered. Fields failed. Diseases spread. Generations later, the facts of the event had blurred, but the emotional contour remained. Fear, dislocation, the sense that something fundamental in the world's order had cracked. Out of that feeling, cultures everywhere spun tales of winters without end, ages of decline, cursed lands, and imminent endings. And then, gradually, as the skies brightened and new patterns of life established themselves, those same cultures began to tell a different story, not only of catastrophe, but of survival. How that slow recovery unfolded, in climate, in economies, and in the quiet persistence of ordinary people, is where we turn next. The first thing to understand about the recovery is that it did not feel like a recovery. Not at first. If you had lived through the dimming of 536, the frosts that bit into summer crops, the hungry winters, and the strange diseases that followed, the years after would not have seemed like a clean turning point. There was no single day when the sky brightened and everyone cheered. There was just a long, uneven climb out of the hole. Tree rings and ice cores tell us that volcanic aerosols slowly thinned through the late 500s and 50s. Temperatures in many regions remained half a degree to a full degree cooler than earlier norms for decades. That doesn't sound like much on paper. But for pre-industrial agriculture balanced on the edge of what was climatically possible, it was the difference between a barely adequate harvest and catastrophe. So imagine yourself in, say, the year 550. You're a grandchild of those who saw the sun turn pale. People still talk about the years of dust in the present tense. The elders remember which valleys were abandoned, which springs ran dry. They can point to the ruins of farmsteads where no smoke has risen in 20 years. The sky now looks normal most days. The sun is sharp again. But the seasons are fickle. One summer is tolerable. The next is wet and cold, or blighted by a late frost. You still plant more than you think you can reap, because you have learned that the sky is not to be trusted. Over time, very slowly, the climate system rebalanced. Sulfate particles settled out. Oceans and land drew down the excess cold. By the late 6th and 7th centuries, temperature proxies show something like a return to the pre-536 baseline. But this climatic normalization took on the order of 40 to 60 years, depending on the region. 2, sometimes 3 generations grew up in a world that felt, compared to their great-grandparents' stories, permanently harsher. And the human recovery was even more uneven than the climate. Some places bounced back relatively quickly. Lowland river valleys with good soils, regions connected to surviving trade networks, cities that managed to keep their granaries stocked. These saw population levels begin to recover within a generation. Birth rates rose once food became more predictable. Fields that had lain fallow during the worst years were brought back under cultivation. You can see this in the archaeological record. New house foundations overlapping the outlines of earlier ones. Pottery styles continuing with only small interruptions. Other regions took centuries. In parts of Scandinavia, Central Europe, and the Alpine world, whole landscapes seemed to empty out in the mid-6th century and stay sparsely populated into the 8th or 9th. Settlements are abandoned and not reoccupied. Forests creep back over former pastures. From the ground's point of view, the disaster is an opportunity. Less grazing, fewer axes, more trees. From the human point of view, it is a long absence. Legends accumulate around the ruins. Places where the old people lived, or where the land is said to be cursed. The Mediterranean followed its own rhythm. The Justinianic plague recurred in waves for nearly 200 years, flaring up in port cities, sweeping along trade routes, then fading. In some decades, the main constraint on recovery wasn't the climate anymore, but disease. Certain coastal regions of the Eastern Empire seemed trapped in a cycle. Repopulation, growth, another outbreak, another culling. Inland, in more isolated villages, populations may have recovered more steadily, but also more quietly, leaving fewer records behind. North Africa, long a breadbasket for the Roman and then Byzantine worlds, faced an especially complicated trajectory. Climatic fluctuations, plague, and political turmoil combined with later events, wars, religious schisms, and eventually the Arab conquests, to push parts of the region into long-term demographic and economic decline. What had been a core zone of Roman grain production slowly shifted toward a different kind of economy, less urban, more pastoral, organized around new power structures. And this is one of the most striking features of the post-536 world, the way political orders reshaped themselves in the long shadow of the crisis. In Western Europe, the Roman imperial framework had already crumbled, but its habits and institutions lingered like ghosts. The volcanic winter and its attendant plagues did not create the early medieval kingdoms from scratch, but they acted like stress tests, exposing which systems could bend and which would snap. Some small polities vanished from the record after the mid-6th century. Others, better organized or simply luckier in their geography, expanded into the gaps. Out of this patchwork emerged the foundations of what we think of as medieval Europe. Frankish dominion in Gaul solidified. The networks of bishops and monasteries became not just spiritual centres, but practical nodes of administration, literacy, and charity in an unstable world. Over the next 2 centuries, that infrastructure would make possible the Carolingian experiment, Charlemagne's brief attempt to stitch together a Western Empire that could rival Rome in name, if not in scale. The memory of famine and breakdown did not disappear. It became part of the mental background that made strong kingship, written law codes, and ecclesiastical order feel like bulwarks against chaos. Further east, in China, the northern and southern dynasties had divided the old Han heartlands into rival courts. The 6th century climate disruptions and famines added fresh pressure to a landscape already fractured by warlords, nomadic confederations, and shifting alliances. Yet out of that turbulence came something very different from collapse: unification. In 581, a general named Yang Jian seized power and founded the Sui dynasty. Within a few decades, his house reknit most of China under one rule. Massive public works followed: the Grand Canal, reconstruction of city defences, standardization of laws and weights and measures. Buddhist and Confucian elites, who had spent generations interpreting disasters as signs of cosmic and moral decay, now tried to present the Sui, and then the Tang, as restorers of harmony. The same world that had seemed to be sliding into the age of Dharma's decline could, under a new order, be narrated as stepping into a renaissance. Between these poles, in the arid and semi-arid lands of the Middle East and North Africa, yet another story unfolded. The 6th century downturn hit pastoralists and oasis farmers hard. Combined with long-term trade disruptions and political strain in the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, this created a zone of chronic instability. Some historians have suggested that such conditions, recurring famine, shifting caravan routes, weakening imperial control, formed part of the backdrop against which a new religious and political force emerged in the early 7th century, Islam. It would be simplistic to say that a volcanic eruption caused the rise of Islam. Religious movements have deep theological and cultural roots, but the timing is suggestive. When Muhammad began preaching, he addressed societies keenly aware of scarcity, injustice, and the fragility of worldly power. The early Muslim community's emphasis on charity, communal solidarity, and a just order under God resonated in a region where old structures had been shaken. As Muslim polities expanded, they stepped into spaces where plague and war had already weakened older empires. In that sense, the slow recovery from the 6th century crisis did not merely restore the old world. It cleared and rearranged the stage for new actors. On a smaller scale, down at the level of villages and households, people were adapting too. Catastrophe is a brutal innovator. In response to unreliable harvests, communities experimented with hardier crops and new farming techniques. In some parts of Europe and the Near East, there is evidence for a gradual shift toward more diversified agriculture, mixing grains with legumes, fruit trees and livestock in ways that spread risk across different species and growing seasons. Terracing expanded in hill regions, capturing thin soils and precious moisture. Irrigation channels were repaired, extended, or dug anew. Storage technology improved. People built more granaries, dug more silos, devised better ways of drying and smoking meat and fish. These are not dramatic inventions like the printing press or gunpowder, but they are the quiet tools of resilience. They blunt the edges of the next bad year. Social adaptations mattered just as much. Extended kin networks became safety nets. In legal codes from the later 6th and 7th centuries, you can see increasingly detailed rules about inheritance, obligations between relatives, and duties of hospitality. These are ways of formalizing mutual aid. Monasteries, which often held significant land and resources, institutionalized charity, almsgiving not as occasional generosity but as a regular function. In times of famine, those networks could mean the difference between dying and scraping through. Not every society managed to adapt successfully. Some cultural traditions, political entities, and ways of life simply disappear from the record in the centuries after 536. Their languages left no descendants, their practices no clear continuations. Others survive only as faint threads woven into neighbouring cultures, but alongside loss there is transformation. Communities that had endured crop failure and plague carried forward hard-won lessons about cooperation, storage, and spiritual meaning. Their descendants grew up in worlds subtly reorganized around the memory of scarcity. This is what historians mean when they talk about resilience. It does not mean that suffering was minor, or that everything worked out in a comforting way. It means that systems, ecological, social, political, have some capacity to absorb shocks, reorganize, and continue in altered form. After 536, some systems broke, others bent and then hardened into new shapes. A few, paradoxically, emerged stronger, having shed older constraints and found new equilibria. By the time Charlemagne was crowned in Rome in the year 800, by the time Tang poets were writing about moonlit rivers and autumn winds, the memory of the dim sun of 536 had probably faded into the background noise of hard times in the days of our ancestors. Yet the world those rulers and poets inhabited, the political borders, the religious landscapes, the patterns of trade and agriculture, had been subtly but decisively shaped by that long cold episode and its aftermath. Empires had fallen or been rearranged. New faiths had spread. Farming practices had shifted. The great game board of Eurasia and beyond had been reset, and above it all the sky had returned to its usual blue. The sun shone as it always had. To anyone born centuries later, it would have been almost impossible to imagine that once it had gone dim for more than a year and the whole world had trembled. Yet the possibility remained, latent in the rocks and the deep magma chambers below, which raises an unsettling question, one our own age cannot quite avoid. If it happened once, could it happen again? The short answer is yes. The long answer is slower and less comforting. Deep under the crust, the processes that dim the sun in 536 have not stopped. Magma is still rising, cooling, crystallizing. Gases are still building in chambers miles beneath our feet. The Earth is still, in geological terms, a restless planet. What happened once, or twice, or many times in the deep past is not finished with us. When people talk about a future volcanic winter, they often invoke a few names like half-remembered incantations: Yellowstone, Campiflegrei, Toba. Yellowstone sits under the forests and geysers of the American West, one of the most studied volcanic systems on Earth. Its caldera, the collapsed roof of an ancient emptied magma chamber, is so large that you can stand inside it and see nothing but hills and sky, never guessing that you're in the scar of an explosion. Campiflegrei, the burning fields, hide beneath the suburbs of Naples and the waters of the bay. Toba lies in Indonesia, a vast lake filling what used to be a crater. These are what geologists call supervolcanoes, systems capable of eruptions tens or hundreds of times larger than the one that likely darkened the sky in 536. Their past eruptions have left ash layers spread across continents, visible today in far-flung sediments and ice cores. They are reminders that the 6th century event, bad as it was, is not the upper limit of what the planet can do. The good news, such as it is that these truly colossal eruptions are rare on human timescales, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years apart. There is no indication that Yellowstone or Campiflegrei or Toba is about to erupt at supervolcanic scale in our lifetimes. But if you zoom out far enough, if you think not in decades but in millennia, the pattern is clear. The Earth has produced eruptions of this magnitude before. Given enough time, it will do so again. The clock is not ticking toward a specific date. It is simply running, and somewhere, sometime, the conditions will line up. And it does not even take a supervolcano to cause the kind of cooling that haunted the mid-6th century. Tambora, which erupted in 1815, was immense but not technically a super eruption. It was still powerful enough to loft vast amounts of sulfur into the stratosphere, shading the sun and altering weather patterns across much of the globe. The following year, 1816, went down in memory as the year without a summer. In New England and parts of Canada, frost struck in June and even July. Farmers watched young corn blacken in the fields. In Europe, cold rains and grey skies lingered for months. Harvests failed. Grain prices spiked. Food riots broke out in cities already strained by the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. In Switzerland, snow fell on lowlands in the middle of what should have been warm months. Poets like Byron and Shelley, trapped indoors by endless storms, turned to writing dark, introspective work, including the ghost story contest out of which Frankenstein was born. Compared to 536, the Tambora event was shorter, better documented, and cushioned somewhat by early modern trade networks. But it offers a smaller scale echo, a reminder that a single volcano can, under the right conditions, reach into the sky and press its thumb on the climate. So what happens if something like that, or worse, occurs in our world? We like to think we are more resilient, and in some ways we are. We have global communication, weather satellites, scientific models, emergency response systems. We can see the ash plume rise, track it, measure its gases, estimate its impact on solar radiation. We can to some extent warn. But the shape of our vulnerability has changed. In 536, most people lived close to the land. Crop failures meant local famine, desperate migration, perhaps the collapse of nearby states. Yet there was also a kind of rough insulation. A bad year in one region did not automatically topple the systems of another, an ocean away. Today, food moves on steel and diesel and data. A significant percentage of the world's calories comes from a handful of major grain belts: the American Midwest, the Black Sea region, the North China Plain, parts of India, Brazil, and Australia. These regions export to dozens of countries that depend on them, a failure in multiple breadbaskets at once. From a few years of shortened growing seasons, altered monsoons, or unseasonal frosts, would not just mean local hunger, it would mean shockwaves. Ports would become choke points. Countries might ban exports to protect their own supplies. Prices on global markets would spike within days, not months. Poorer nations that rely on imports could find themselves abruptly unable to buy. Urban populations far from any field would be at risk in ways a peasant of the 6th century might understand all too well. Prolonged volcanic winter would tug on many of those threads at once. Food, energy demand, political stability, migration. The models we use to estimate such cascading failures are sophisticated, but they are still, at heart, educated guesses. On the other hand, we are not helpless. Around the world, scientists monitor volcanic systems with a level of attention unimaginable even a century ago. Seismographs listen for the tiny tremors that suggest magma is moving. GPS stations measure millimeter-scale swelling of the ground. Gas sensors sniff for changes in sulfur and carbon dioxide. Satellites watch for heat signatures, deforming landscapes, and travelling ash. In many cases, this network can give days, weeks, sometimes months of warning before a major eruption. Not always, and not perfectly. Volcanoes are notoriously individual in their behaviour, but often enough to evacuate surrounding populations, reroute flights, and begin emergency planning. What we cannot do is stop the eruption. We cannot vent a supervolcano safely, or cap it like a leaking well. The energies involved are on a scale far beyond our current engineering, nor can we fully prepare, in advance, for the complex ways a multi-year cooling would ripple through agriculture, infrastructure, and politics. We can store grain, diversify crops, develop hardier varieties. We can run simulations, draft contingency plans, strengthen local food systems. All of this helps. All of it buys time. But the lesson of 536, viewed from our present, is a humbling one. Even a civilization that considers itself advanced, organized, and in control is, in the end, living under an open sky. The people of Justinian's empire, of the Sasanian court, of the northern and southern dynasties in China, did not know about stratospheric aerosols or sulfate deposition. They did not know which mountain had blown, or whether the darkness would last 1 year or 10. They saw the sun dim, the frosts deepen, the sickness spread. They looked for meaning in theology, in omens, in cycles of virtue and decay. We, for our part, can trace the sulfur spikes in ice cores. We can name candidate volcanoes. We can write equations that connect aerosol loading to radiative forcing to crop yields. We can say, with some confidence, that events like 536 and 1815 lie on a spectrum of natural variability that the Earth has produced many times, and yet there is still much we do not know. We are still piecing together what exactly happened in those years, which eruption or eruptions were responsible, how the climate system responded, how societies adapted or fell. In that sense, the darkened sky of 536 has not entirely cleared. It still casts a long, faint shadow over our understanding, a reminder that our records are fragmentary, our reconstructions provisional. Somewhere, a future historian may look back on our own age and see, in satellite data and digital archives, the traces of a great eruption, the way trade routes shifted, the way governments rose or fell, the way art and religion responded to a sudden sense of cosmic vulnerability. They may wonder what it felt like to watch the sun go strange, knowing a little more than people did in 536, but still nowhere near enough. For now, we live in a time of ordinary skies. The sun rises, yellow and untroubled. Plains cross its path. Fields ripen in expected seasons. It is easy to believe this is the default state of the world, but beneath us the magma moves. Above us the atmosphere waits, and the story of 536 lingers, whispering that our sense of security is, and perhaps always will be, a kind of truce between human plans and deep indifferent forces, a truce that will, one day, be tested again. And yet, for all of that, we are still here. We have followed one particular thread through the tapestry tonight, a span of months in the year 536 when the sun seemed to fade, when summer felt like autumn, when frosts came early and left late. We watched that dimming sky spread outward into a volcanic winter. We saw harvests fail in field after field, the granaries empty, and famine walk across continents that had thought themselves secure. We traced how, in the chill shadow of that event, disease found its moment. The Plague of Justinian rode along trade routes that had once carried silk and spices, turning the arteries of empire into pathways of death. We watched political systems crack under the combined strain, borders shifting, dynasties faltering, faiths and philosophies reshaping themselves to explain a world that no longer behaved as it should. And all the while, at the centre of it, there remained a mystery. Which mountain, or mountains, did this, one eruption, or several? A single titanic blast, or a drumbeat of smaller events? Ice cores, tree rings, and scattered chronicles point in different directions, like witnesses remembering the same storm in slightly different ways. The outline is clear, the details blur at the edges, but perhaps that is part of why this story lingers. It reminds us how fragile we are under an altered sun, and how stubbornly resilient we can be in the dark. People in 536 did not understand stratospheric chemistry, but they understood hunger, grief, and the need to go on. They planted again, even when the last harvest had failed. They traded, migrated, prayed, argued, adapted. Out of those cold grey years, new worlds slowly emerged. The sky that seemed for a time to be closing in did not. It cleared. It almost always does. If you've drifted with me through this long night of history, and you're still awake at the edge of sleep, you can let that thought rest beside you, that our ancestors have faced skies far stranger than ours, and somehow found ways to endure them. If you enjoy journeys like this, quiet walks through the darker corners of the past, you might also like the Sleepy Time history book about prehistoric secrets, waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com. It's there if you'd like to explore further, at your own pace. And if this story kept you company tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd gently like this video, subscribe for more nights like this, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. It's a small way of stitching our scattered midnights together. For now, though, let the questions about vanished suns and restless magma drift to the back of your mind. The sky above you, whatever its weather, is quiet enough for rest. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let sleep rise to meet you.